I think we'll go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for today's seminar. I'm Eileen Kladivko in the agronomy department, and I invited Ankita for today's seminar. So just a very brief introduction. Dr. Ankita Raturi is an assistant professor in the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering here at Purdue, over in that beautiful new ABE building. She's been here almost 3 years, I think, but I met Ankita probably 5 years ago or so. She was a postdoc with Dr. Stephen Mirsky in the Beltsville ARS research lab, Stephen working with cover crops, and Ankita was some kind of computer scientist that Stephen had said, oh, I've hired, there's a special program where they're trying to bring computer people into agriculture. And so he was able to get Ankita as a postdoc on that program. And I don't remember any other details other than that there was a computer person who knew nothing about agriculture, but was eager to learn, which is the key. So, like I said, Ankita's been here about 3 years. I've had interactions with her through that work with the cover crops and then our Midwest Cover Crops Council. She's working on some tools with us on that. And with that, I'll let her take it away and tell us whatever more you would like to tell us about yourself before you start, Ankita. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me. I will share my screen and then just kind of get started and tell you a little bit more along the way, if that's all right. So I believe y'all should be able to see my screen. Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Great. So good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Ankita, as Eileen mentioned. I am indeed guilty of being a software engineer by training, and I did definitely get my postdoc from the USDA's Ag Research Service, and in fall 2019 came out here. For the most part, right, that's kind of the cliff notes that you need about me to be able to sort of digest some of the stuff that I'll be sharing. I come from a CS background, and I've learned about agriculture and the amazing and interesting use cases y'all have in here. I've always had a passion for food and agriculture, and so in grad school, it just made a lot of sense for me to start doing all my work applied in there. And so in grad school, I was actually looking at small scale diversified farms in California, and started really thinking about information challenges in that particular domain. The work I'll share with you today is primarily agronomy facing, so I'll be showcasing some of the work that we've done in cover crops, and I'll tell you a little bit about some of the stuff that we've got cooking today. But it's my pleasure to be able to share an overview of my research, of how I practice design, modeling, and software engineering in service of a more resilient future. So, assuming my slides move, there we go. I like to start my presentations with a little bit of an acknowledgement that, you know, Powder Drone, y'all have been designing technologies for agriculture for a really long time. And so in that sense, you're right, technology is old. You've had centuries to refine design processes. And so the design of technology is not new, but our approach, our guiding philosophy, some of the ingredients that we have, including digital ingredients, are the things that have changed. And as we're experiencing the fourth industrial revolution, we went from having, you know, purely analog farms to a situation where everyone is faced with this glut of data. And so the challenge really in the coming centuries will be to consider how we can harness the power of these digital technologies to be able to enable us to gain a range of insights to be able to, you know, improve and sustain and grow with care. And so my work really sits at this boundary of trying to think about how we can create different kinds of tools to empower a range of stakeholders. And that's kind of the theme within all of my research. But I think we can kind of all agree that the general premise that we've collectively come to is that software gives us the ability to manage increasing agricultural complexity across scales, especially as we start to think about how to encourage and support people in their adoption of a variety of sustainable ag practices. Software, I think, has this beautiful ability of helping us with giving us the right information at the right time and providing this supportive system that can help us, you know, do the things that we're most interested in a little bit better. And so our desire to manage this sort of agricultural complexity has really allowed a range of explorations to occur. You know, we see a lot of work done in computer vision with respect to identifying weeds and pests. There's a lot of interest in geospatial analytics and a whole mess of technologies in between. And so today I'll just kind of focus on this one piece, right, of how we can empower stakeholders with decision support tools. I think, you know, there are so many different delightful tools out there. One of the things that I'm really passionate about is trying to think about how we can improve them to better support farmers, advisors, researchers, anyone really involved in the ag enterprise. So I start with just, let's tease apart technology just a scooch, because I know especially in ag, there is a lot more work on the hardware side and software is really growing, right? But if I think about it this way, you can almost imagine technology as including these two pieces, the hardware and the software, and there's always a coupling between the two. Hardware really allows us to manipulate the world, right? A tractor will manipulate the earth, it deals with physical interactions, whereas software really allows for us to manipulate information, right? Then this is what I love about software. Software allows for us to engage in these hypothetical interactions. It allows us to hallucinate about the real world and think about how we can improve it in different ways. And so in that sense, software really allows for us to augment human thought. And we do this by developing a range of tools for people that, you know, take advantage of these models of the real world. And so we see things like predictive analytics and real-time monitoring and tools for problem diagnosis, and even tools for communication, coordination, collaboration, like these video conferencing tools that we use today, right? These are all part of that suite of technologies. And this is kind of what we need to envision new futures where we can grow food more sustainably. So in my lab here at Purdue, I run the agricultural informatics lab. What we really do is think about how people design, build, and use technology to do a range of things in food and agriculture, whether it's growing and distributing food and ag products, or managing natural systems, or even doing things like strategizing for food and ag system resilience. But again, I'm going to really try and keep this a little bit focused on some of the use cases that I thought you might be interested in the most in your department. So we draw on a range of disciplines and practice a range of methods, from ethnography to conduct user research, information modeling to be able to serve up unified though heterogeneous ag data. And then we also engineer software systems like the decision support tools I'll share with you today. But I think the thing that really enables us, especially those of us like myself who come from the computer science side of things, to be able to do this work in a manner that I think is productive, is the communities of practice that we work with, right? And that Eileen pointed out how I met her, right? It was through the council's work. And so that's an example of some of the communities of practice that we work with in our research. Okay, so if we zoom out to the landscape of digital agriculture, there's a flood of data in ag that's being matched with a flood of tech options, for better and worse. There are many genres of software for production agriculture with a niche and specialized tools coming on the market every day. I love this graphic from Better Food Ventures. They do this landscape report, I think sort of every year. And this is the most recent ag tech landscape report that describes what's out there and tools. And you'll see tools that are used from farm production through planning and farm management. There's some market access stuff in there, and there's some financing technologies, but it provides a really great overview, at least from the commercial space, of what people are currently working on and what some of the different areas of development are. More recently, and I think more related to areas that I'm interested in, they put out this climate smart soil tech landscape report that begins to outline at least some of the tools that are available for practitioners of sustainable agriculture. And if you zoom in a little bit more, inside that little red circle that you see there, that's kind of where my work fits in, right? That decision support space. But we know that there are significant challenges with respect to adoption and use of technology, right? There was an insightful survey that I'm sure many of you have seen that came out by the Trust in Food Group that talks about what are the challenges that farmers are facing. They just simply don't use tech, including farm management tools. They're unsatisfied and mistrustful of technology sometimes. It's, it's still expensive. It's still inaccessible to many growers. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect between all the cool things we're building, what people need and want, and that space in between. And so that's kind of what I'm really trying to think about, right? How can we think about the things that influence adoption? These are the things that affect the time and space people actually have to learn something new and integrate them into their own work practices. So there are many challenges that as technologists we can't fix alone, like some of these institutional barriers, or even sometimes the lack of data. And that's where I look to collaborators like yourselves in agronomy to be able to actually work with us to say, okay, here's the kind of data that we have, and these are some opportunities for decision support, and so on and so forth. And so there are a couple of different sort of contextual challenges that we face. But in my work, I sort of really focus on these sort of 5 essential challenges that I think serve as a litmus test for the potential of tech adoption. And so the first one is really thinking about utility. Are we actually building things that are useful for farmers, or are we just scratching an itch? The second challenge is really thinking about usability. How easy is it to use? Tools shouldn't, I want software for ag to be as easy as some of the stuff that we enjoy for fun, right? One of my favorite apps is a citizen science app called Seek, and it's delightful. I want agricultural software to be delightful, right? And that's kind of why I do the things that I do. We also have challenges that are a little bit more ornery, like interoperability, where we think about how we can move data across tools, devices, and systems. And there are lots of different modeling techniques, information modeling techniques that we can bring to bear to solve some of these challenges. There's that, ever-present trust issue that we have in technology. I, as somebody who uses consumer electronics, also have my own trust issues with technology, and we see the same with users of ag tech. And then the last sort of challenge that we're sort of grappling with is this idea of resilience, right? The most resilient tool out there right now in agriculture, I would argue, is a spreadsheet. It stood the test of time. So how can we build things that are comparable, right? How can we build tools that are robust and reliable and adaptable, that might even maybe one day outlive the spreadsheet? That's kind of really the challenge. And so in my agronomy facing work, I focus on this question, right? How can we design effective decision support tools that empower farmers and advisors to improve sustainability in agriculture? So if we begin by unpacking sort of what the kind of work we're focused on is, I start by characterizing sort of a lot of different kinds of work that we see in agriculture as knowledge work, right? If you're using historical sales data to choose what to plant this season, that is a genre of knowledge work, and so on and so forth. And so there are many different types of activities that we do in agriculture, whether you're, tracking cattle movements or scanning in-field camera footage. These are all examples where you are essentially using data to learn something, solve a problem, or make a decision. And so you start to see these repeating genres when we're thinking about the kinds of work or the kinds of practices or the kinds of things that people are actually doing in agriculture. And I'll do a little bit of sort of just context setting, so we're all using the same words the same way. And let's even just start with data, right? I define data very broadly. There are symbols that represent the properties of objects and events. These can be a photo of a field. It can be a qualitative description of some sort of weird thing you saw in a corner of a plant. It can be an actual measurement, right? And so there are lots of different kinds of data. They're recorded information of any kind, regardless of the form or method of recording. And so at the end of the day, we can characterize each of these data that people are using to do knowledge work as observations. So if data are observations, information are the process data, right? You're structuring it, you're doing something useful to it. That's where your data science comes in sometimes. We then convert this into knowledge, where we want to be able to create explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. I think a lot of times we actually look, and rightfully so, to folks in extension, for example, to be able to give us the knowledge that we need to be able to apply in our fields. And then we actually start to think about, how can we actually enable wisdom? And the reason I go through the motions of going through this entire thing is when we think about technology in agriculture, I see us trying to support each of these different pieces in different ways, right? We have lots of data collection tools to help people with just the collection of the data, management information systems for the information. Decision support tools are really focused around that knowledge piece. And I always think of them as assistive, something that a grower and their advisor are looking at together to be able to make conversation and have informed decisions come out of what they're doing together. And much, much more downstream, something that we're sort of like all trying to head toward are the recommendation systems, right? So expert systems and that type of thing. But that's a little bit further out there because we're still trying to solve some of these fundamental challenges in 1, 2, and 3 still. Okay, so let's do a quick sort of a sampling of what some of the DSTs out there are, right? So decision tools are these interactive software tools used by decision makers to help answer questions, solve problems, and support or refute conclusions, right? Using data to do work, to make decisions. This is sort of what I think of decision support tools, the OG decision support tools or worksheet, right? It's a structured piece of paper that has things that you need to fill out here. It takes you through the steps, it shows you're working, it teaches you a little something along the way. And at the end of it, you have a number that you can go and use to do some work. And so in this way, NRCS's worksheets are some of the most interesting and useful decision support tools that people will often start with. If we move through the sort of technology chain, we also see a lot of spreadsheets and decision support tools. I'm sure that many of you have also created spreadsheet decision support tools. This is just an example of one that is made by some of our collaborators. This was a Palmer Amaranth Management Decision and Herbicide Interaction tool that was used to enable weed management. And again, in this particular case, it's just a worksheet, but in this case, it's digitized. And so we're beginning to start to see the computer really step in and start to play a supportive role. In this particular case, the computer is serving as your memory and a quick lookup for different kinds of information and doing a little bit of number crunching on your behalf. Then we start to see some really cool things out there that actually start to pull in external data, right? These are the climate stress maps that I saw on the ARS website a while back, right? In this particular one, you're using public climate data. You're really just coming here to get a quick consult to be able to do things like figure out the likelihood of heat stress on cows to enable your livestock management. And this is one that actually comes out of Purdue as well. I saw this a long time ago before I came to Purdue, and I was always glad to be able to know that now I'm neighbors with the folks that built this. This is a growing degree tool that can be used to enable activity planning, climate risk assessment, and marketing, and a range of other interesting activities. And so really, we are beginning to see the sort of progression of decision support tools, right? From analog worksheets all the way through to these complex model-driven tools even, right? So COMET-FARM would be an example if we go all the way through this chain to the very end of something that actually has an entire model baked into it. Right, but I'm not here to provide a lit review of every DST out there, but just to provide a framework by which we can think about DST efficacy, try to think about how we can put decision support tools in our toolboxes and actually design better decision support tools, right? So you can sort of think of this as the context in which our decision support tools sit. So I'll give you a little bit around sort of theory of decision support tools, just because I really love the work that is out there by some of my peers. And this is a model that is on decision support tool uptake and ultimately use. It's a result of a survey of British farmers and advisors around their use of DSTs. And this graph, you can see, talks about some of the core factors, including trust, including relationship between farmers and advisors, some of these very social issues that actually influence technology adoption. And I think many of the social scientists in the room will say, well, of course, human factors influence technology use and adoption, right? And I would agree, tools are inherently socio-technical systems. And so from my vantage point, this means that when we're starting to think about the design of tools, we actually have to take this married approach where we're considering the social interactions, the context of use, as well as the data available and the decisions that people are trying to ultimately use that data to make. So another piece that I really love, and this is around spatial temporal scoping of decisions. Some of the work that's out there shows that really specific decision support is really valuable, right? Just saying, I'm going to give you general guidance and hand waving is not really productive. I don't need a tool to do that. Rossi and his colleagues describe this in the context of crop protection, right? And you can really see how they talk about how strategic decisions all the way up here involve several years, both at farming and crop scales. You can see some of these tactical management decisions that are sort of made more day-to-day or within a day, or even in response to what is happening at the crop level. And then we have these operational decisions where you're really just trying to sort of engage in this like really quick response to unpredicted events at the crop level or within crop level. And so my work for the most part kind of sits over here, but these are some sweet spots for DST design, right? And so I encourage those of you who are engaged in it to at least consider this as a reflection diagram of where does your work, what particular scope, spatio-temporal scope of decisions are you trying to support? And so I really enjoyed this paper and I would strongly encourage it if anyone's interested. But that same group of researchers also looked at sort of optimal information delivery mechanisms for different kinds of spatial scales and directionality of the information, right? So warning services that are more along the lines of extension materials, that's where, you really want to be able to push information out to users. For example, a map displaying disease spread, IoT devices or on-site devices that are typically comprised of an in-field sensor, as well as a couple of other pieces, are often great data collection tools when you need to get local data. And so you can kind of see how different kinds of tools sit on these axes. The sweet spot for the genre of tools that I really work on is really when the user wants to be able to pull site-specific information for operational, tactical, and strategic decision making. So it's really that pull that I'm interested in. And I think that's really where web-based tools actually really start to shine, because you can start to bring all these different pieces of data together. So this is the DST dream, right? Like, we're all trying to sort of plod along this journey of not just, helping people figure out what happened, but also why it happened and what to change. And most importantly, down the line, how to actually improve once you've figured out the basics. And so I mostly share this image as just an example of how we're trying to move through the spectrum of support and the different kinds of technologies that can be used to help people answer each of these different kinds of questions. Okay, so I'm now going to dive in to a very specific case study. I'm going to share with you some of the work around my cover crop decision support tools. And hopefully this gives you an insight into at least how I take this type of literature, synthesize it, and turn it into an actual process, as well as a product that we build with our communities of practice. Okay, so let's consider this decision space. In our work, we really focus on one of these. In this particular work, we focus on one of these management practices, and that's cover crops. And I feel like it would be preaching to the choir, but I'll do it anyway a little bit. When we talk about cover crops, I've been informed at this point that they provide a range of ecological services and also are kind of beautiful. But this management complexity that happens when you start to actually bring cover crops into your system does incur this sort of massive cognitive burden. You're trying to balance crop genetics, environmental conditions, cultural practices, system management. So in a lot of ways, bringing cover crops into the mix actually does increase sort of the number of things you're playing with in your mind. So if we all agree that effective cover cropping is knowledge intensive, we can start to see where some of these different data come from that people are trying to use to make different kinds of cover cropping decisions, right? There are many tools. They're starting from, the original books to the supplementary tools like the plant hardiness zone map. There's a lot of different kinds of soil maps out there. And there are tools, there's data in unexpected places as well as expected places sometimes, right? So the USDA plants actually has a subset of cover crop data. There's a cover crop chart. And so, right, there's a lot of information out there. Some of it is public, some of it is private, some of it is proprietary, but you end up with a lot of different kinds of tools. And the thing that really ends up happening is that you end up with having a lot of silo data. And so for me, the question really becomes sort of what do we focus on? And someone once cautioned me not to bother corn farmers with potato questions. And I thought it was a delightful phrasing, but that's kind of the point of decision support, right? You're trying to engage in timely, specific guidance. And research on user preferences within DSTs, again, supports the sentiment, right? People want specific decision support in their tools. Again, not just those broad or general guidelines. And that's kind of what we're trying to do with our work. So a quick acknowledgement that there are a couple of communities of practice that we work with, NRCS and Northeast there initially is where we started. And then we've been working with the cover crop councils. Again, I started with the Northeast and the Southern, and now thanks to Eileen and her crew have been working more closely with the Midwestern Cover Crop Council. And so this is kind of the community of practice that I'm looking for guidance with respect to our work. So when it comes to thinking about our cover crop DSTs, there are a couple of user groups that we're really focused on, right? It's growers themselves, people who are trying to find a cover crop to meet their farming goals, advisors who want to be able to advise said growers on cover cropping, but that includes selection and management. And then we have explorers, right? I could fall into that category even, people who just want to learn more about cover crops. And so these are the kinds of users that we anticipated were coming to the types of tools that we're working on. And really what the desire that we heard from many of these different user groups was this need for full stack decision-making, right? Everyone wants it all. they want to select species, they want to create mixes, calculate this, do everything, and then, have it also finish their laundry. And that's really hard because you can't actually do all of those things in one tool. And so the solution to trying to actually support people in each of these different steps is this modular architecture that we're trying to roll out with the cover crop tools. And that means that each tool is solving a specific purpose. It brings in site-specific data, timely data that you need for that decision, right? That spatio-temporally scoped decision. And then as you move into the next phase, you go to a different tool. And that means that you start maybe with a species selection tool, you move on to a seeding rate calculator. I realized I thought there was another slide, but right, you're sort of going through each of these very specific decisions. And I think the key thing in this space, especially as we start to think about, you don't want to get disconnected all over again, then is that interoperability piece. So how can we enable data sharing between those tools, but also a seamless user experience across those tools, right? And so for us, that's really the challenge, is trying to think about data moving across these different platforms, but then also having the user experience be something that is a little bit more uniform. So from a construction perspective, what leads to effective cover crop decision support? I argue there's two things, and this is kind of how our work has played out. The first one is on the data. You actually need that high quality regional cover crop performance data, as well as some local field conditions. This is usually what's behind the scenes in a web app. And then you also need a design, right? An improved user experience that actually reduces that information overload. If we go back to this notion that introducing cover crops into a system can sometimes increase the cognitive burden on a grower, this is one way in which we might actually begin to start to reduce that cognitive burden. And this is usually what you see on the screen. So we started with a range of existing data and tools, our cover crop data, right? When we're working, and now I'm giving you I realized I should have mentioned that I'm going to be talking specifically about the construction of the Northeastern cover crop tools in this particular case, right? So we started with a Midwestern data set. We also had a data set from the NRCS New York seeding rate tool. We also started with some supplementary data sets from IDIS for taxonomy information from the plants database to be able to get some agronomics and morphology information. And then we also did some scraping of Surgo to be able to get some soil conditions. And we also actually have some weather data that we're using. Our colleagues over at NC State have built out a weather API that we've been using to be able to make sure that we also have site-specific weather information. Okay, so how do we do it? We put together a data curation process that brought together over 50 cover crop experts. And so these were folks from the Northeastern Cover Crop Council. There were farmers, crop advisors, researchers, and more. We were following and building on the model of data curation that was started by the Midwest. And so this was sort of our evolution of that process, right? And it really came down to, we had a development team. We created some data verification sheets, and I'll show you some of them in a minute. We had zone team leaders that were leading a small group of experts for each plant hardiness zone in the Northeastern United States. They would subset our cover crop list, right? So all the data was at least standardized across each of the plant hardiness zones. And then they would verify and input data for each of the different categories that we had. So show me the data. What does the data look like? This was our data dictionary, so you can at least start to get a little bit of a sneak peek into it. We're using a tool called Airtable in case anyone's interested. It's kind of like a spreadsheet database hybrid that allowed for us to actually have conversations about the data together. But in this particular case, right, this is what the data dictionary looks like. So you can start to see some of the buckets of data. And this is what the actual data looked like under the hood, right? So these was just the taxonomy information. We actually scraped IDIS to make sure that it was compliant with that. This is some of the basic agronomics. And so a little bit of this data comes from USDA plants. Some of it comes from the Midwest. Some of it comes from lots of other little places. And we actually have sources for each of these different data. A lot of the soils data comes from Surgo, right? So we scraped Surgo and then brought in some of this information. And then the cover crop experts actually went through each of these and made sure that they had selected appropriate parameters for each of the different cover crops. We had some planting information, we have termination information, whole lot of information. And so now we're actually working with the cover crop councils to package up all these data as an API with the data management portal so that y'all can also use and contribute it too. So soon enough, you'll be able to access this data on the back end as well as on the front end. But I'll show you a little bit on the front end now. Right, so if we talk about this front end side of things, let's talk a little bit about the human-centered design process. So if you think about design, let's say the design of a bridge, Most of the time you can start by thinking about things like, what does it look like? What is the architecture of it? What a kind of load can it bear, right? Very structural conditions about the bridge. You can also think about some of the aesthetics, right? Something like, what color will it be, or that type of thing. When we talk about user experience, specifically user experience design, we're talking about the lived experience of interacting with something. So this would be, where will the bike lanes go? How will we deal with congestion and traffic? We want to make sure that both pedestrians and bicycles have a pleasant user experience. And so when we think about the user experience, I want you to just remember that I'm talking about the lived experience of interacting with a thing. In my case, it's with technology. And so, you know, one of the things that I thought was kind of delightful as we're looking around to see what are the different cover crop user experiences out there, we found that you could even buy cover crops from Amazon. And what this allowed us to do was to actually start to learn more about what different kinds of things people were looking for as they were searching for information about cover crops, right? I love this visualization. It shows how it goes in your rotation. There's a whole lot of things that we can learn when we start to think about how people were actually wanting to use cover crop data, or find cover crop data, or digest cover crop data in this first piece. From there, in our case, human-centered design involves working with a group of stakeholders to actually then start to do some low fidelity prototyping. So we did lots of sketching with our partners, sharing of these early sketches, and I did not show them my napkin sketches quite yet. I did do the next version up, but this is sort of like where we start, right? Is by thinking about both the structure and aesthetics of the piece of technology, the lived experience of the technology, and then putting these pieces together in some low fidelity sketches. So we took what's known as a participatory human-centered design approach. And there are many reasons for why this approach makes sense. I'll just give you a few that we had and how we approached it. The first was because we wanted to be able to bring together diverse user perspectives, right? So being able to hear from growers, from advisors, from researchers, from a range of people allowed for us to make sure that our tool wasn't inadvertently ignoring some obvious challenge that people have already encountered out in the world. And so what we did was we just had a couple of virtual stakeholder meetings to actually discuss some of these user requirements. The second thing that we were trying to do was give stakeholders and users agency over and in the technology, right? So not just over the process of design, but also in the use of it and downstream in their ability to actually make recommendations about how to improve it. And so we started by actually having, for example, design sessions using our high fidelity mockups at cover crop and agronomy conferences. And we would actually have, and you know, at Tri-Societies, we had about 20 people sitting in a room, going through the mockup together, providing us feedback, going through a worksheet, and engaging in this dialogue about how this thing, in our case, it was a species selection tool, can and should be built and what we should be considering in the design of things, right? So again, we're trying to give people agency in the design of the technology itself. And then the last thing that we're sort of trying to do now, especially as our tools have been, our first tool has been rolled out, is try to think a little bit more deeply about how to make sure that we connect back that tool design to the user decision space and work practices, right? So this is pretty much, you can think about it as, this is how people are currently finding using cover crop data to be able to make decisions. Where does this tool fit back into their toolbox, right? Is this something that is really scaffolding their existing practices, or is it out of the way? Did we get something wrong? In a lot of ways, this is part of evaluation, but it's also part of us thinking about how to refine our tools as we move into the next phase. And so we're hoping to do some focus groups with farmers and advisors to be able to assess the integration of this tool into their current workflows. And so this is at least just a little bit of an idea of how we're going about doing some of this work. So the tool, this is the tool. You can go to covercrop.tools if you want to check it out, right? So in this particular case, we're using a little mapping API to allow people to draw a polygon around their field. It then selects their plant hardiness zone. It pulls from Sergo some of the information about their field. They can override it. This is that weather API that I told you about. They then select some of their goals. And then from there, it filters to give them a set of cover crops that work well for their site conditions and some of the goals they might have. And then you can whittle it down some more, right? And so we use the metaphor of a wizard to be able to actually walk you through this. You've probably encountered a wizard in a user interface many, many times in your life, but that's what it is. And then we try to make sure that we have these filters that give the person a sense of where and when their data is. So when they've filtered down, what they're actually seeing, and in this particular case, a little visualization of how it fits into their calendar and so on and so forth. I kind of just blew through the entire tool, and sub 1 minute, but if you're interested in poking around a little bit more and even providing feedback on the tool, there's a feedback form and a whole bunch of other ways in which you can get involved if you're interested and curious to learn more about the tool. Okay, so I've been going pretty fast, so I'm going to slow down just a scooch and share now just a little bit more about what's coming down the pike. So, I mentioned our partners in the Midwest, right? We did not build this particular tool, but this one has Midwest data that is more relevant to you. I'm sure you've seen it before. We're now working with Island Politico and the MCCC to both migrate and integrate in their tools, as well as cook up some tasty new treats. And so hopefully we'll have fun things to share with you in the very near future. This is a seeding rate calculator that we're currently working on. This is our medium fidelity mockup that really just goes through the workflow. And so a lot of work behind the scenes has been done, and just trying to make sure that we're really guiding the user down a path that is most helpful for them, that allows them to input their data in a way that makes sense. And this is a unified design effort that we're doing with both the Midwestern Cover Crop Council and the Northeastern. And so now we're actually going to be building it out in the next couple of months. Actually, my developer started a couple of weeks ago, so hopefully we'll have something to show for you guys to check out in about late 2022. But this is kind of where we're headed with at least the seeding rate calculator, following those same design principles. Okay, so I'm coming to the close, so I figured I would just share a few different projects that we have ongoing that are not cover crop related, but cover crop adjacent, and a couple of invitations to collaborate with us in the coming months, years, and so on. So just a quick reminder, right? So what do we do in my lab, right? We think about how people design, build, and use tech to do a range of different activities in food and agricultural systems. This, if we zoom out back to that soil health space, as a project that we just kicked off, the DASHI project, which focuses on design for agricultural soil health information. We're doing this with a whole bunch of different partners within a community of practice known as Open Team. In this particular work, we're working with farmers and buyers, open source ag tech model developers, and interdisciplinary team of researchers. And what we're really interested in here is to try and be able to think about how we can distill the essence of soil health information practices to enable us to redesign and design a family of technologies, right? So this is everything from sampling tools to stratification tools, tools to be able to communicate your soil health practices, right? But there's so many different tools out there that the problem really, if we go up by slide, is really thinking about how we can create a seamless user experience as farmers are having to collect and manage and use all of this different kind of data to be able to improve soil health outcomes. And so in this particular study, we're actually going to be working with farmers and ranchers for the most part to begin with, and then eventually tool developers and curators to be able to inform the future development of these appropriate technologies. And so we'll be doing a whole bunch of interviews to map data flows. We'll be doing some really fun collaborative art making is one way you can think about it. And this is through cultural probes. So we'll actually be sending out little kits with cameras and worksheets and maps so that we can try to understand the context of data work. And then we'll actually do some participatory design workshops where, again, we'll create those very specific user interfaces for us to be able to, either us or our collaborators in the tech space, to be able to develop and actually implement some of the things that people are looking for, or redesign their user interfaces to meet those user needs that we learned about or will learn about in our interviews. And so I'm really excited about this study. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. If you want to learn more, feel free to express interest. The website is actually currently not on because we're submitting our IRB. And so if you want to learn more, just reach out to me and I'll let you know. We have another fun study that I thought might be interesting to y'all that is also currently being rolled out. And this is actually in collaboration with our very own College of Agriculture's Ag IT group. And so we're working with them to try to think about how we can create seamless form and spreadsheet user experiences as Purdue researchers are collecting agricultural data in labs and fields across diverse projects. And so this summer, we're hoping to do a couple of in-person focus groups, yay, with data collectors to be able to map data pathways. And so the 4 groups that we'll be doing tentatively are sort of, focused around data collection in fields and on farms, data collection in the lab, data collection of the packs, and then data collection via these sort of citizen science and non-research collaborator pathways. And so we are, designing the study as we speak. And so for me, this particular one is an invitation to come guide our work. I'd love to hear what y'all think, what you're interested in, and what your ideas are. So if you want to chat some more, feel free to reach out to me as well. Okay, so I got to end with an invitation to draw some pictures. And so my ask of all of you, as especially as we're not physically together in the room, is to try to think a little bit about how we can better support farmers, advisors, agronomists, and other stakeholders. I invite you to engage in some light co-designing of decision support tools. So whether you're having a beer or a cup of coffee later, just sit down with a piece of paper and imagine you're at your favorite farm. It's a great day, it's gorgeous, but someone's called you with a really hard problem, and you're talking to them, they've called you out there, you're looking at things, and for some reason you pull out your phone. What are you doing? Are you calculating something? Are you looking up some information? Are you taking a photo? Are you trying to analyze something? Just try it. Tell me what you want this digital portal, this black mirror to do for you. Draw a storyboard, share it out with me, and let's use that as a point of chatting. Right? So let's use that as an excuse to start talking about a way in which you can build something cool together. All right. Oh yes, teaching. I did add this a little bit. Because I know that many of you are also advising or working with students, and some of you are students here at Purdue. I do teach a pair of courses on ag informatics. So in the fall, I'll be offering a skills-based course, Intro to Ag Informatics, in which we cover sort of Python and web app development and a whole lovely set of skills around that. And then in the summer, so right now I'm teaching this seminar course with primarily graduate students. It's oriented towards trying to be able to workshop together and read some papers together around research and practice in ag informatics. And so if you want more information, some of my teaching, all my materials are open access as well. So you're welcome to go and check them out. Okay. With that, I did promise Eileen I would try to be somewhat timely. I will end. I will open up for questions and discussion. I hope I had answered at least some of your ideas or questions around decision support tools. But thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you. That's all I got.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Ankita. That was very enlightening and energetic seminar. Lots of great ideas there. So let's just open it up. You can either type something in the chat, or you can, I think you have the power to unmute yourself and ask a question. So let's see what kinds of questions or comments people might have for Ankita.
This is Jared Doucette. Oh, did I speak over somebody?
Nope. Go right ahead. Thank you.
All right, cool. Thanks, Ankita. You covered a lot, but the framework you provided, and I think, defining some of the terms really help, get us all on the same page and understand what you're getting at. So I appreciate that. You showed a lot of data, and, I like the idea of the modular system and building it in pieces that talk together. That has a lot of benefits both now and going into the future, taking care of things. How do you balance these really complex data-driven questions that people have with their expectations that it's kind of click button app answer? Some of these processes can take easily hours to work through, if not longer. So what are some tricks that you've found over the years, either in how you present it or how you get people to use it, and whether they're aimed at a single user or a group of users, that kind of thing?
Yeah, for sure. There is a wealth of information around how to be able to support decision makers in this particular way. And I'll give you just a couple that you'll see reflected in our tool. So I talked a little bit about this wizard metaphor, right? And the wizard metaphor is the click next to continue thing that we see literally everywhere. And while it can be annoying sometimes because you feel like you're filling out a glorified form, part of the sort of the theory behind why it works is because it actually allows for somebody to be able to read, digest, and make the next decision. So you're kind of breaking down this sort of massive decision they're trying to make into these very concrete steps, right? And so simply modularizing your decision in and of itself actually helps the person, because right now I'm not trying to think about every single thing I want to do with cover crops. You're just asking me, where are you? What's your soil like? What is the weather? right? You're asking some very specific questions that in the aggregate actually help me then put together the right set of things for you to start looking at, right? And so that sort of leads us to the second piece, this idea of filtering. Right, so filtering and searching are two things that we see a lot in tools that we interact with, right? Whether you're shopping online for shoes or whatever, you'll likely have put something in the search bar. And so trying to make sure that as you're building things out, whether you're using keywords that are searchable, thinking about the language that you're using, right? So the match between the words that you use on the screen and how people naturally talk about this stuff really matters, right? So that's kind of why we actually went to cover crop conferences and had people play around with the tool, because they'd be like, that's not a word we use to describe that. And I'll be like, oh yeah, we didn't know how you refer to blank, right? Termination, or like roller crimper. It was like the weirdest word that I learned early on. I was just like, I love this word. It's such a specific thing. It's actually a specific piece of machinery. And like, I didn't know that vocabulary, right? And so oftentimes tool developers don't have the vocabulary. And so I think that's especially where working with communities of practice matters, right? And so there's lots of little things like that, but hopefully that gives you at least something to work with. And I'm happy to chat offline if like specific things you're looking for. There's lots of design resources out there.
Okay, looks like we have a raised hand from Autumn Denny. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you can and ask the question.
Hey, Dr. Raturi. So I wanted to ask a question as we're kind of talking about the language that people were using. I was kind of glitching out, so I don't know if someone asked this already, but how are you planning to bridge that language gap between farmers and kind of more of the like academic people?
Yeah, that's a really great question and a hard one too, because I think in a lot of ways, especially with the cover crop work, right, people have scientific concepts that they're trying to communicate. And you don't want to veer too far away from the terms that you're hearing from the researchers because they are very specific things. And so in some cases, actually having explainers, right, and this is something that I think Extension does a lot of, right, having materials that explain different kinds of terms, having a data dictionary that explains the terms that you're using in our case, are some of the ways in which you can start to bridge that gap. The second thing, however, I think also, especially when we think about the cover crop data, and this is kind of why we have the project around the plant data service, right? There's lots of different kinds of plant data. Some of it is more useful for researchers, some of it is more useful for farmers, but we have this challenge with respect to the vocabulary that's baked into those tools. And so within the plant data service project, what we're trying to do is map out how different people are using words to be able to describe the same thing. So in addition to having a cover crop scientific name, we have regional synonyms because people in different parts of the US are calling the same plant different things. And so that's another example of how we're actually trying to bake that into our data model. So having colloquial terms in addition to scientific terms sometimes can be one way in which you handle that particular issue. But yeah, it's a huge problem, and trying to think about how to do it in a manner that is respectful of all vocabularies can be a huge challenge. Thank you for your question. Any others?
Jeff Valenick has his hand up.
Thanks, Eileen. Ankita, I enjoyed the presentation very much. You closed by talking about data map pathways and things, and it struck me earlier, but it picked in your presentation, but especially then, how have you used librarians and library resources to do this? Because I think they've been, right now, as they get into like the functioning of PER and things like that. We're teaching a course on systematic reviews in agriculture and meta-analysis too, that's kind of related. You know, they're really good at workflows, data workflows. That's what they do. They also are really good at searching the primary literature. And I didn't see anything in your presentation about primary literature and using it as a foundation for the evidence underpinning action.
Yeah.
And so, and meta-analysis. So I'm just kind of curious where is this placed relative to systematic reviews like you'd see in medicine and places like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I am so glad that you brought up sort of the library sciences. My home department was an informatics department that was sort of a library science department in its origin story. And so it's one of those things where a lot of the techniques that we use are certainly something that folks in the library sciences and information sciences use much more regularly. So let me start with answering a couple of the pieces that you have. So with respect to systematic lit reviews, we currently do not have any systematic lit reviews on cover crop data that we have in here, but there is a collaborating project in which there were a couple of students who were supposed to be doing some of that sort of meta-analysis type work, and that data would then come into our data set. And so for each of the different variables that we have in our cover crop data set, we actually have sources for each of those, and ideally they would be coming from those. And so this is kind of where on the data curation side of things, we've been thinking a little bit, and that's why we're building a data management dashboard. How can different types of people contribute data? How can you actually go through and understand the provenance of that data, right? Verify it, make sure it's correct, make sure it's not just like some made up numbers from Ankita Raturi, right? Make sure that it's actually accurate and verifiable data. So that's kind of how we're trying to address that piece. The other part, I think you talked about data mapping data pathways. This is something where we've been using a lot of methods, again, that I think are in common with those in the library sciences to be able to think about how data is moving through a system. So in my case, it started early on with being able to even just do something like map artifact trails. Like, where does the data start? How does it go into a piece of paper? How does that get digitized? How does that move into a database? What happens to it? Is there metadata, and so on and so forth? And so one of the reasons why we're doing these academic studies to actually start to map some of these pathways is so that we can try to start to make more informed decisions about when and where people need data, when it needs to actually be a tool, and when it really doesn't, because it does not make sense. And so that's kind of why we're trying to take that approach and sort of use these methods that are also in common with folks from other disciplines. I think those were at least a couple of the major questions. Did I miss a piece that you might be curious about?
No, I think that covers it. I think the evidence underpinning decision-making is becoming really important. I know, like the carbon markets, one reason carbon markets aren't taking off very well is just that the modeling underpinning it, the evidence underpinning the price points and the rate of accumulation of carbon in soils is just not clear.
Yeah.
And I think having a body of information that's really well vetted in a systematic review meta-analysis showing when it happens, when it doesn't happen, what are the impediments. I think you might also find that with the soil health, which is also contains elements of soil carbon sequestration and things in there, that it's going to take a really deep dive into the primary literature to sort out the effects and where this works, where it doesn't. So just curious, just interested in this whole process.
So if I may maybe add a little piece in there. So we actually do have, one of my students is doing a systematic lit review around, or mapping study around, agricultural ontologies, because I think one of the things that we also wanted to be careful about is that there are lots of ontologies, vocabularies, right? There's a whole gamut of things that already exist, right? And I think actually this kind of relates to Autumn's question around why are we doing, like, what's that disconnect? For us, one of the reasons why we're even doing this is because some of those ontologies don't actually work when you're trying to build a tool, right? Because the language is different. It's more oriented towards a computational geneticist than it is a farmer. And so trying to then think about how our words map to those ontologies, or how our concepts and relationships map to those, is something that we're really interested in. And so that's one of the pieces that we're doing that I think also starts to bump up into sort of the research data space. And then are you looking at the ontologies developed by the CG system? Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be a good place to start the agronomic ontologies anyway.
Yeah, so we're looking at like Plantiome and crop ontology. There's a breeding API. So we have a whole list of them that we're looking food on and starting to think about sort of where some of the gaps are. The other piece I think that might be interesting to you is, so when I originally went to the USDA, it's because I really wanted to be able to do this work as a public service. And so my ideal for the plant data service or a tool like that would be for it to actually get adopted by libraries, including the USDA's National Ag Library, right? So for us, the goal with this work is to be able to create open source infrastructure that other people who are more well-versed in then certain areas can iterate upon. And so we're really just trying to build out that first prototype as an invitation again for people to collaborate with us on the building of these pieces.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Do we have any other questions or comments out there? you can raise your hand or unmute yourself and
Yeah, I have a kind of a follow-on question to Professor Villenex. Regarding the body of evidence you were talking about there, as far as the literature that comes out and whatnot, ultimately all that comes down to subjective sort of opinions, right? Like, how much mass of belief do I assign to this body of literature versus this or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, like you talk about like a wizard, and most traditional wizard type workflows, they don't really account for a lot of subjective belief or disbelief in certain things. Are you incorporating that or plan to incorporate any of the subjectivity to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So right now we don't have anything like that baked into it. All we really have is an explanation of where the data is coming from. And so whether it's the stuff that you're seeing in the wizard, right, with the soils data, we simply say this is coming from Surgo because we're just kind of using it. With the cover crops data themselves, I would say that this is where we are trusting that the cover crop experts that we work with across the councils, who are in and of themselves doing their own primary research, are giving us good data to work with. And so one of the things that I would love for us to be able to start to document a little bit better in the data model itself is where these data come from, any assumptions. And so thinking through that part of the data model is something that I'd love to be able to explore with anyone that's interested.
Thank you.
Cool,
I think
thank
Nathan's
you.
point's a good one. I think Chow in libraries is really good at that. And I can get his email for you, but I think the inclusion exclusion part, what of the primary literature, what stays in, what goes out, how does it meet, your explicit question that you're asking, and then where does gray literature fit in? Because you're relying an awful lot on gray literature and non-refereed literature. Even the NRCS stuff is not refereed. It's reviewed internally, but it's not refereed in the same sense that a field crops research or an agronomy journal article might be. And so I think part of it is the strength of the evidence, and it's really important. It's a great problem. It's a great place to be playing these days, but it's really complicated. And it's fun for biophysical scientists like myself and others on the call, I'm sure, to get exposed to this, because it's cause you to pause and rethink what you're doing.
Oh, cool.
do we have any other questions? One more question we could probably handle. Okay, well, if not, let's give Ankita a virtual or a real clap. Thank you so much, Ankita. It was a very, very interesting seminar, and hopefully you'll get some follow-ups from some people who are interested in collaborating. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. Take care, everyone.